Just testing volume. Can everyone hear me throughout the room? Good in the back there? How about now? Is this any better? Yeah, okay. All right, then let's get started. Good morning. My name is Stephen Gallagher. A lot of you probably know me. If you don't, that means I haven't asked you to do anything yet. So, I'm here today representing the Fedora Server Working Group, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the product that we're producing, the Fedora Server product. So what I'll do is first I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the history of the Fedora Server, little technical issue. Okay. Lost my place. So we're going to give a little bit of an overview of the history of the Fedora Server, and then go into some of the really cool features that we intend to land at least a first blush at in Fedora 21, and then talk a little bit about our longer-term strategy into Fedora 22. And then I'm intending to leave a fair amount of time at the end of this talk. There we go. I'm intending to leave a fair amount of time at the end of this talk so that we can, so that I can actually ask you, what are your great ideas? What haven't we thought of yet, and what should we be doing in Fedora 22 and 23 to make this a real success? So, first of all, who are the members of the server working group? Most of these names I suspect that you know if you've been following the devel list. Pretty much everybody on here is a very active contributor to Fedora. I know actually only myself and Miloslav happen to be in the audience today, but Merrick, I trust that you will keep me honest if I lie. Oops, first shot. So one of the things that always kind of irked me about the devel list was about twice a week I would see someone post an email to devel list that said, and I quote, "Fedora is not for servers. If you want to run it on a server, run X." And that always bugged me because, well, X was usually RHEL or CentOS or Scientific Linux, or somebody telling them all three. And that didn't sit well with me because all of these are derived from Fedora. And while certainly Red Hat does a great job hardening once they fork, it seemed to me that if they're all based on Fedora, then presumably somebody somewhere decided that Fedora was good for servers, and they were just going to clean it up. So I was thinking to myself, how can we make that better? How can we actually make that process better? How can we make Fedora a better upstream for those distributions? How can we make Fedora itself a good tool for developing server applications? So last year at Flock, I ran a talk called the Fedora Crystal Ball, imagining the next 5 years of Fedora, and we had a lot of interesting discussion. It was more of a question and answer forum, except I was asking questions of the audience. And, figuring out, I asked the audience to put themselves 5 years in the future and tell me, presuming you're still running Fedora in 5 years, what does it look like? What are the things that you are now doing with Fedora that you probably aren't doing today or you're doing differently? And that ran for a while, and what we discovered fairly early on in that talk was that no one had any real idea where we were in 5 years. So, as what started as a thought exercise, I brought something up that I'd been talking to a few of my colleagues about off and on for a few months beforehand, about the idea of targeting Fedora, the idea of taking Fedora and picking a few audiences and producing something for those audiences. And this built a little bit upon certainly Matthew Miller's rings theory, We were talking, except I was trying to take it a little further and say, well, maybe Ring 2 has different targets. And so I brought that up, and we discussed that further in the Crystal Ball talk. And people seem to like the idea. They like the idea of making a Fedora server that was stable but still fast moving. They like the idea of making a Fedora cloud target that was better than Ubuntu, better than CoreOS. And certainly the majority of the audience also loved the idea of making a workstation target that was targeted at Fedora users, at Fedora developers too. So a few months go by. We communicate this on the mailing lists. We take it to the board in FESCO, and this Fedora.next initiative actually takes shape. And we gathered together a group of individuals. We asked FESCO to volunteer a representative to start each of the working groups for these products, as well as the base design and the and environments and stacks groups. And I drew the short straw for servers. So we started and we put together, as part of this process and requested by FESCO, a series of product requirement documents and technical specifications for what each product would look like. So for the Fedora server, what we decided right away was that we wanted it to be, we didn't want it to be an alpha for RHEL. We wanted it to be a server for fast-moving applications. We wanted it to be the place where you want to deploy that cool new technology that you're writing, because chances are it's going to take a lot of work to get it onto RHEL 6, or whichever RHEL is 2 or 3 years old at that point. Because you're probably using Ruby, or you're using a new version of Python, or the latest version of Java. And you're not going to want to wait until RHEL 9 for your application, to deploy your application and to sell it. So we want Fedora to be the place where, at least for those prototypes, and at least for those first passes, you want to install Fedora server and deploy that. And in a DevOps model, which makes this much easier, we want you to be able to deploy Fedora server and then just keep updating it and know that your apps are going to continue working. And at the same time, of course, we want to work with those downstream distributions, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about how we're actually going to be working closely with one of the CentOS SIGs to make sure that we are producing something that, once that next major release of the enterprise operating system hits, it becomes a seamless transition for them to host those applications long-term on a supported platform. And as a Red Hat employee, I have to say, preferably with a support contract. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tactics we want to use to get here. First off, we're very focused on availability. We want to make sure that Fedora server is solid. We don't want you to see a kernel panic. We don't want you to be hitting bugs on a regular basis. We want to make sure that updates of your packages and that if we move from Fedora 21 to Fedora 22, that if you've deployed a domain controller here, that it's not going to break on you during an upgrade. Another piece that we really want to talk about is manageability. Historically, Linux has not been a great citizen in the manageability front. It's extremely powerful. You can do absolutely anything with Linux as long as you know how to do absolutely everything with Linux. So for the Fedora server, what we want to do is we want to actually try and narrow that down. We want to be able to talk to the small and medium businesses. We want to be able to pull in the group of people that have 17 Microsoft admins but really can't afford them anymore. And we want to make it easy to get started using Fedora server. And then certainly we want them to be able to use all the power that Linux offers. But we want to get them in the door, and that's something that we're historically not great at. Historically, it's just, we've told people, hey, you should use Linux. They try it. How do I do this? Oh, well, you edit these 7 config files, and then you compile this program. Yeah, that's not going to work. So a major focus of the Fedora server process is making that simplistic. Compatibility, I touched a little bit on when I talked about availability. We want to make sure that what works on Fedora server today will continue working, even if it does. If we do an upgrade, I want it to be compatible. If we do a backwards compatible, if we do if we have updates in stream, or if we upgrade between major versions, I don't want there to be a period where the clients of that server ever notice that it happened. Things can change on the server itself, but the clients of that server should be completely oblivious to the fact that the server is upgraded. Extensibility. We can only do so much ourselves. This has always been one of the great powers of open source, is that, well, it's missing a feature, here's a patch. I want to make sure that everything we do to make the Fedora server powerful and make it simple and easy to use has a mechanism to add more functionality easily, not necessarily, well, I need to go and patch the kernel because I need to be able to do bridging. I think that's something we can make the routines and the tools that we're building accept extensions and accept plugins that allow us to say, well, Fedora server today is capable of running a domain controller, but I want it to run a web server, or I want it to run a DNS server now. And, well, we didn't get around to writing that yet, so you can wait for us to do it. Or, here's a really simple plugin interface. Why don't, I'm going to just give you, I'm going to spend 2 weeks and I'm going to give you a memcache server. And then, resilience. Whatever else we do, I want to make sure that even when, not if, the server fails to perform correctly, it becomes easy to recover. So these are some of the major high-level tactics that we're using to reach those goals. So the first major new feature in Fedora server is something we're calling Rollkit. Rollkit started out of the PRD really, as we asked ourselves, if you're building a server in the traditional pets model, and if there's anyone here who hasn't heard this metaphor by now, you're lucky, first of all. But there are two models for running a server. There's the pets model, where you bring up a server and you treat it like a pet. If it gets sick, you take it to the veterinarian, and you make sure that it always stays alive. If you have a cat, however, if you have 1,000 cows, you number them. If one of them gets sick, you kill it and you buy another cow. So the Fedora server is really meant to solve the pet side of this metaphor. It's meant to handle those pieces of your infrastructure that, no matter what, are always going to be the ones that you need to keep alive. They're going to be the domain controllers and the database servers and and the DNS servers and maybe the routers. And these pieces, you really don't expect to have, these are not scale-out type systems. They're mostly scale-up systems. These are the systems that are more likely to run your ERP, for example. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to make it simple to get some of those core services up and running with the minimal amount of effort, ideally avoiding any command line more complicated than deploy domain controller. We wanted to make sure that this was publicly accessible, documented API. So we came up with Rollkit. Rollkit is two main components. It's a daemon that runs a dbus service, and it's a command line tool for that operates against that dbus service. What it does is it's a daemon running a series of plugins that, for each server role concept that you want to deploy. These server roles are things like, again, a domain controller, where we say, I'm not necessarily that tech savvy. I want to try out this Linux thing. I want to pull this into my environment. And I want to just say, give me one of these with best practices. So instead of going through and reading a long piece of documentation where you figure out that, okay, I need the following 17 command line arguments to this install script for it to work, and if you get one of them wrong, you probably have to reimage the machine because you're not going to be able to roll it back. So the idea behind Rollkit is to make this deployment really, really easy. Right now with role control, essentially, for the database server role, which Lyric is working on, to the best of my knowledge, it's going to be the command role control deploy database server. That's it. That's what it'll take in Fedora to install a PostgreSQL database server with best practices deployment and default settings. Similarly, but slightly more complicated, is the domain controller, where it's going to take a few. It has to have a few mandatory arguments in order to get through. You need an admin password. But really, we're pulling it down to the absolute minimum set of information that you need from an admin to get this thing up and running, and get it up and running in a way that will make sense for 95% of your deployments. So, what do we have planned for Fedora 21? In Fedora 21, we're going to have two initial roles, as I understand it. I didn't get a chance to check with Merrick on whether or not we were on schedule for the database server. For the domain controller, we're going to have a first pass. That is the first domain controller in essentially what an AD admin would call a forest. In Fedora 22, we're going to work on replicas and possibly also AD trusts, depending on how many resources we can put on this and how interesting it is. This, I think, is a major piece of, like I said, the foot in the door. If some hobbyist wants to bring Linux into their corporate environment, I want them to be coming in and saying, here, let me turn on this gray box, install Fedora server, and then hit this button, and we've got a domain controller for any other Linux servers we want to pull up in here. I want the result to be somebody's eyebrows going up. I want people to be saying, oh, but I thought that was supposed to be really hard. And then I want them to stop saying that very quickly. So moving on to Fedora 22, I think, and Fedora 23, the set of roles that we intend to produce as part of the server working group are, and we've talked about this, going to be those roles that are the most useful infrastructure pieces to enable applications. So things that any application you might be building and deploying would want to be able to talk to. So the obvious two we came up with for the first pass, the most important two, were domain controller and database server, because everybody's going to use those. Every deployment, any real world deployment is going to have both of those things. Most deployments will also need a caching daemon, such as memcached, for just vastly speeding up their applications. And if you've ever been to a company without a file server, it was probably a restaurant. And maybe not that. So these are definitely our next big pieces. We want to figure out how to make an easy deployment of these things. Memcache is probably going to be fairly simple. It doesn't require a whole lot of options. File server, on the other hand, that's going to take a full Fedora cycle, without a doubt. And there's a lot of nuance there. There's a lot of question. Well, do we use guest access, or how do we set up some mounts for guest access, and how do we make sure that the clients can mount this sanely and discover it? And there are a lot of questions there. I'm hoping that I'm talking with especially the Samba community, and I'm hoping that we're going to have a really good story for that in 22 maybe 23. It might take a little longer than 22. The second major feature that we're going to be delivering in Fedora Server is, I'm sorry.
Sorry,
Well,
are you taking questions?
I was going to take them at the end, but if you, I'll give you one.
Well, so I was going to, you mentioned the extensibility before, so it's one of the points of the roles, though, is that the community will be able to work on roles that they find appealing, right, in addition to the targets that you're already planning for 21, 22, and forward, yeah?
All right, so for the recording, Paul's question was, we talked before about extensibility, and he asked, so the community will be able to work on roles based on Rollkit in addition to the ones that the working group is working on. And yes, I probably didn't make that clear. The plugin interface is going to be public. It's going to be fairly simplistic as far as what you need to provide to it, and the implementation on the back end can be as complex as you want it. So yes, we absolutely hope to be getting roles contributed by the community. And actually, this was the part where I was going to mention CentOS and completely forgot. We've been talking about this with the CentOS Simple Linux Server Special Interest Group, which was founded fairly recently, and they were going to try and do something very similar based on a RHEL 7 core. And I think it was Matthew Miller that connected me to them, but don't quote me on that. I pulled them into a couple of our server working group meetings, and they discovered that, wow, the stuff that we're planning and have started implementing is pretty much exactly what they were hoping to accomplish. So we're going to be working closely with them, and they're probably going to continue and deploy some of their own high-value roles, such as a groupware suite, for example. So it's already, we're already building our community back with this effort, because we're now pulling in, as I said at the beginning, I wanted us to be the upstream for the RHELs and the CentOSs of the world. And they're coming to us and saying, yeah, that's where we should be building this, so it filters down to us. So now I'll move on now to openLMI, which is the Open Linux Manageability Infrastructure. And as I talked about before, some of the core problems with Linux is that it's very difficult to manage, especially in large numbers. Everyone's got their own shell scripts. None of them look like their next door neighbors. So what we started about 2 years ago now, 3? 2, thanks. We started building a public interface based on DMTF standard SIM, and I see many of you wincing, which is the appropriate response, to be a common public interface for performing management operations, things like setting up storage, changing networking settings, querying the system for which hardware it's running on, and things like that. So it's a very powerful interface, and it's very low level. We've actually, we started this as a project for RHEL, but it's even getting a fair amount of interest in Fedora, where well, to step back, I want to tell a little anecdote, and I'm not allowed to say to whom I was speaking, but I was talking to a person who has several thousand Fedora instances as a server farm in their environment. And I was talking to him, and I was telling him about openLMI, and he was saying to me, why didn't you do that 10 years ago, first of all? And describing to me that having the ability to tie all of his machines together with this common interface was going to make his deployment a lot easier, as well as making sure that he can manage his updates and things with it, because he doesn't really have anything like a satellite server for his Fedora deployments. It doesn't really work that way. So openLMI, I think, is going to be a very powerful tool. It's also very, very easy to use, and this is why I like when people wince at SIM, because our engineers have done an amazing job of building higher level tools on top of the SIM interface that makes it extremely approachable while retaining its power. So the two major pieces that we added there are the LMI shell, which essentially was our answer to Microsoft's PowerShell. It's an easy-to-learn scripting language that allows you to perform basically any low-level system task that openLMI can handle, and do it in a way that is not terribly dissimilar to how you were hacking together your scripts before. It's actually a specialized version of Python. It uses the Python interpreter and a few extensions we added to it. Well, default modules really is all Python syntax. So it has one major advantage over PowerShell in that you don't have to learn a whole new scripting language to use it. Then on top of that, because, well, even that was still complicated for the novice user, the OpenLMI project built the LMI command line tool, which is an extremely simplified but very powerful tool for getting some of the easier data or some of the common data. Things like, tell me what hardware I'm running on. In one line, create a RAID 5 array. That one got a lot of attention at Summit. And just generally takes a lot of the really common tasks and makes them extraordinarily easy to accomplish. I've actually stopped in my own life using a lot of the old command line tools because the LMI command makes them so much easier. And of course that works remotely or locally, so it becomes easy to manage a lot of systems in that same way. Now, the last major piece that we're adding to the Fedora server is Cockpit. I suspect that a lot of you by now have heard of Cockpit. It's a really, really pretty web-based management system for Linux. It's web-based because we expect that the Fedora server probably 90% of the time is going to be installed on a headless machine. So classic graphical management tools, you either have to export them from the box and be running a full X server, which is wasting valuable resources, or you need to have a head on the, you have to go down with a crash cart and plug in a monitor and still be wasting a whole bunch of resources, but for a shorter period of time. So Cockpit is a really nice, modern design management system, and I'm going to give you a little demo later, but some of the major cool things about Cockpit. First of all, it's socket activated, so so it's not wasting any resources unless you're actually using it. It can you can easily manage the system that you just started up. You can automatically deploy a Fedora server and immediately be able to administer it with Cockpit. And in Fedora server, we've set up systemd presets and firewall rules so that is the case, as opposed to classic Fedora, where you would have to manually turn it on first, which kind of defeats the point of using a management tool. If you have to SSH in to turn on your management tool, there's a failure in your plan there somewhere. But it can also talk to any other machine that is running Cockpit and manage those centrally and gather together some of their heuristics, some of their, you can look and see how their CPU is being used and memory utilization. At present, and Andreas could correct me, I don't believe we can perform actions across a series of machines yet at the same time. But
no, I mean the multi-machine management right now, it's I would say it's right now basically a list of things.
So so today multi-machine management is essentially read-only, but there will be future enhancements. When I've been talking about Fedora server, Cockpit has certainly been the one that has gotten the most attention, the most, oh hey, that sounds good. And then when I show them, it says, okay, so when can we have it? And then also, when can we have it in RHEL? But that's a different question entirely. The general populace seems to be really excited about Cockpit, and I've also seen a fair amount going through in the media. So I think that's going to be a strong piece of our story, and it's going to help us get a lot of people filtering through and trying Fedora server when it comes out. Another piece that I think this is part of what makes Cockpit so appealing, is that it, as I say here, it plays well with others. Unlike some of our historical tools for managing the system, the system config star, for example, particularly webmin or system config networking in specific. When you use Cockpit, you do not resign yourself to a future where you are only using Cockpit. everything that Cockpit does, it does through a standard system interface. So you can continue managing any tool you want, managing it with any tool you want on the local system, or through a shell script, or through your classic, hacked up system admin scripts. And they will immediately be represented on the Cockpit screen if you happen to have it open. So you can make you can spin up a Docker image on, on the command line, and suddenly it'll be available for monitoring on the Cockpit screen within a couple of seconds, I think.
Yeah, it's probably,
Yeah.
and same for storage
Yeah.
or anything else.
So, and actually on that note, that's one of the major features of Cockpit that people are excited about too. Cockpit is coming out to be one of our premier mechanisms for, I should probably stop doing that. It's coming out to be one of our premier mechanisms for keeping an eye on and managing the Docker containers that you're running on a system. So, sorry, getting out of the camera frame apparently. So it's really quite neat, and it's a very easy way to get a quick look at how many resources are my Docker containers using, which ones are really drawing drawing the CPU, start them up, shut them down, and generally treat them with whatever care they need to make sure that you're still serving everything that you're asking of it. Gonna be honest, I lost my train of thought there. So what I'm gonna try and do, and be warned, this is a live demo on this laptop, so it will probably break. But I'm gonna do a quick demo of Oh, I just really like that background. I'm running 21. All right, so I have to do this all from my shoulder, which is always fun. So. Does this work? Oh. So I'm going to log into this. So I type my password correctly. Of course
Well, you can use the conference microphone if you like.
This works as well? Oh, should have known that. Okay. Hey. Pretty sure I typed that right that time. Don't you love live demos? There we go. Thank you very much. So the first screen you see when you log in is the list of machines that are connected to this Cockpit server. So as this is just a live demo on my own personal machine, all we've got is the local machine. So apparently, given the CPU history, I really was ramming on that keyboard while I was typing my password. So once we click in here, the first view is actually probably the most interesting on the system. It's a really nice series of continuous graphs on exactly what is going on, how much memory is in use, how much CPU. Very little network traffic, mostly because I think I fell off the network again. You can get a pretty good set of stuff. This system information is a little bare bones right now. However, this is really cool. If you're not familiar with Realmd, Cockpit is tied tightly into Realmd and allows you to directly join a machine to a free IPA or Active Directory domain with almost no information. That's all. That is all it takes. And apparently, and it auto-detected that there's an Active Directory domain on this network. I'm not going to join it. It also provides a very good view of the systemd services available in the system, as well as full controls over starting, stopping, enabling, disabling, masking, any of these devices, any of these things. The journal capabilities in Cockpit are actually really quite neat, because what they'll allow you to do is go through a service and tell me and say, I want to see the entire history of the journal, but only for this service. I want to see exactly, I know that this service is unhealthy right now. Where did it go wrong? Things like that. And a lot of that are capabilities that were made. A lot of that were capabilities that were made available by systemd and journald, which are major features of recent Fedoras. Where's my mouse cursor? There it is. So the storage controls are actually quite neat too. We've got. I can take a nice deep look at exactly how I have my drive formatted, which is, if I'm not mistaken, the default Anaconda setup in this particular machine. And if I plug in another drive, it gives me a lot of well-guided controls to turning it into exactly whatever mount point I want and whatever file system I want. So I think this is going to prove to be very, very handy, even for non-server cases. I can see people choosing to use Cockpit over traditional command line tools just for their workstations as well. So I would eventually like to see, and I'm just kind of directing this at Christian here, I would eventually like to see Cockpit around for workstation installs as well, possibly as a web app tied into the GNOME environment type of thing. Why do I have a different picture on these? That's strange. Okay. And like I said, I'm just going to jump to one last thing. I've got a couple of containers running on this system. I was working for a while on seeing if I couldn't build a roll control or a Rollkit container-based memcache server. So you can see I actually managed to keep it pretty close to the default Fedora size, and I'm pretty sure we're going to be shrinking that Fedora size down even further soon. So that, I think, is going to be a really nice way to solve some of the role problems. Is for those roles that are very simplistic and don't take up a lot of space, what I'd love to do is I'd love to build those into containers where possible, so that even when we upgrade to the next version of Fedora, or even if you make the two version jump, your containers are still going to run, and they're still going to be able to offer exactly the same services until you choose to manually migrate them. Unfortunately, we can't make this the default option for a while, because one of the few downsides we've discovered with Docker is that it only runs on x86-64 right now. The Fedora server is intending to run on x86-32. It's 32-bit x86. It's intending to run on at least ARM, some ARM v7 HL systems, and certainly on ARch64. So in Fedora 21, Docker only runs on x86-64. Fedora 22, it may also gain ARch64 support, but we're still not going to have the 32-bit support that we would need for this to be the general solution, unless we decide to retire 32-bit entirely. And I'm not confident that that's something we're going to do before Fedora 24, to be honest. So, let me just get back to my presentation. In conclusion, Fedora Server is going to be awesome. Eventually. There's a lot of work still to be done. Fedora Server in Fedora 21 is definitely going to be a first attempt. I do want to set expectations that despite the long cycle, and a lot of that was due to the additional planning, it is in its heart, it is a 1.0 of a completely new idea. So I urge people to try it out. But I'm not going to strongly recommend that anyone run it in production in 21. questions. And I actually used up more of my time than I expected to. So, Christian.
Any plan of supporting deploying server roles through Cockpit?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. The server, that was originally going to be the plan, but time and resources were a limitation getting into 21. I'm very much hoping that we can do that in 22.
I hope so as well. Yeah.
I'm sorry, the question, yes, to repeat the question was, will Cockpit support deploying server roles? And the answer you heard. I think somebody over there was asking a question. I'm gonna go.
I was going to ask, could you repeat the question?
With the server roles, for the memcached, you don't need to ask any questions, but for the file server, you need to ask me as admin several questions. So how you will address this in the role control?
So the question was, for some roles, obviously we don't need to ask any questions, but for something like file server or obviously the domain controller, we need to have certain information from the user. At the API level, the way it's currently set up is that we pass it a dictionary of the settings that it must know, and then role control will verify that the input contains all of the right settings before it'll go and try to do anything. At the role control command line, they're basically just passed as arguments. When we do something in the Cockpit, that'll be Andreas's job here to write up a UI that asks those questions and first of all ask the fewest number of questions in the politest way possible.
Will you still be able to go into /etc and edit config files?
And that was the part I was saying about. I'm sorry. The question was, will you still be able to go into /etc and configure config files? That was the part I was saying about plays well with others. Yes, absolutely, you will be able to do that. And as soon as the service that you change is triggered to take effect, something like, if you're looking at Cockpit, it will immediately notice that it has happened.
So it'll be better than firewall D.
That was unfair comment, and I'm not repeating it.
So sometimes you have these applications that need settings or services from other applications, saying service account in LDAP or whatnot. Is that going to be, or is there already an interface for such things as well?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I fully understood the question.
Like, you install a web app that needs a database, needs database name, username, password.
Okay.
Is there going to be an interface to trigger that happening as well?
So the question was, when you have a database, you need a username and password to set it. To me, that just seems like that's one of the questions you have to ask when you set up a database. Or, another option that we might do is we might just set it up with a default password that that we hand back to you. It depends on what the UX user experience designers think is the best way to kick off the initial application. But again, that basically goes back to the same as before. That yes, some of the roles require input, and it's a matter of working with the user experience designers to make sure that input is displayed sensibly.
Or perhaps to answer the current latest is not going to be multi-server orchestration.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
This is not a multi-server orchestration system.
Right. Well, I think that's just a Cockpit specifically. I think he was talking about the server roles in general. He was saying, Mirek here was saying that Cockpit isn't really a multi-server orchestration system, but I'm not sure that was part of the question.
Neither is Rollkit.
Neither is Rollkit. Yes, neither is Rollkit. I'm sorry. What?
I was as much interested in Cockpit than in Rollkit.
Right. I suspect that I'm not fully understanding the question, so why don't we try and talk that out after?
Sure. So I think this is a similar maybe question is like, I think there's a distinction between what that Rollkit / Cockpit, right, are trying to set up, and basically what I'm looking for is validation that I understand it correctly, is that Rollkit is trying to set up components of an environment rather than so prefab components rather than prefab applications. So
Yes.
in other words, I wouldn't
Okay.
necessarily be installing, some version, Identica, right? Like I want, I go get Identica and plop it on a machine.
Okay,
I'm
so
gonna
that's-
install the pieces.
Yeah, so that, you're right, that's more of a validation than a question, but the question, effectively the question was, well, let me just phrase the answer. The idea behind the roles is that they are not applications exactly, they are services. They are the pieces that you would use to build a wider application. So if you were creating you're creating WordPress, you're going to want to connect it to a database server. So we want to be that underlying piece, that piece that you can that has a firm backup set and can scale up as needed. Those components are what we're building in roles. If you're we do not expect nor really want anyone to write roles that deploy an application, because that gets, well, for one thing, the settings on something like that will grow to the point where it's kind of violating our I don't want to say policy, but our intent to keep everything very simple. I'm over time, so I'm going to take one last question, and that's it.
Just going to add to that comment, there's plenty of work going on around orchestrating full applications, but it's not just happening in Fedora Server, because it's very much applicable to things like cloud as well. So the Fedora Server is not just the whole story there, there's plenty of work going on beyond that does more directly answer that question.
All right, so Stephen Tweedy was reminding us that there's plenty of work going on in orchestration in other areas of Fedora and development, and that we'll be working with that stuff, but it's not strictly Fedora Server efforts. All right, well, thank you very much for listening.